Hi everyone, today we will talk about the physiology of the motor act, the movement. The idea of movement starts in the sensory association cortices of the parietal, temporal and occipital lobes. These areas will then project to the frontal association cortex, which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, via the long association fibers. This frontal association cortex is located rostral to your premotor cortex and also your frontal eye field. This is the very seats of the thought process and the internal commands that culminate in the motor act. So the command to move is transmitted from the frontal association cortex to two places. First is the cerebellum via the corticopontocerebellar pathway. And then the next one is the basal ganglia via the corticostriate pathway. The cerebellum and the basal ganglia exerts a modulating effect on the motor command. They help to fine-tune the motor command. So the cerebellum will give an output to the thalamus, particularly the ventrolateral nucleus via the dendrothalamic pathway, whereas the basal ganglia will project to the ventral anterior thalamic nucleus and reaches there via the ansa lenticularis, the lenticular fasciculus and the thalamic fasciculus. From the thalamus, the internal command to the movement is generated in the frontal association cortex is now modulated by the input from the cerebellum and also the basal ganglia. So from the thalamus, it will actually project to the motor and also premotor cortex via the thalamocortical projections in the internal capsule. So the command for the movement now is transmitted to the spinal cord motor neurons, particularly the alpha and gamma neurons, via the direct and indirect pathway. The indirect pathway is via the brainstem motor centers. The direct pathway is via the corticospinal system, the pyramidal system. So when we talk about the indirect pathway, the motor signals will go from the premotor and motor cortex to the brainstem, particularly the vestibular nuclei, the reticular formation, the red nucleus via the corticobulbar, the corticoreticular fibers and also corticorubar fibers. From there, then it will send a signal down to the spinal cord via the vestibulospinal fibers, reticulospinal fibers and the rubrospinal fibers. Whereas the direct pathway is via the corticospinal tract. So it would then the cassette at the lower medulla and go down, travel in the lateral corticospinal tract down to the spinal cord. So at the spinal cord level, the motor signals will reach the skeletal muscle via the peripheral nerves and the muscular junction to effect the command to move.